Just the last people getting in. Welcome everybody, warm welcome to you all at this Studium Generale lecture here at Maastricht University. Very happy that you all showed up for this, I think, special lecture, but of course we have many special lectures, but on the truth about Eve. I grew up in the 60s, 70s with the idea that there's a lot of difference between men and women. And of course, we also learned from many or some evolutionary biologists that women were evolved in humans to take care of people, where men had to go out and hunt and do their stuff. And this idea has been so strongly in our culture, and is now so strongly in still many of us, and maybe even in me, where, as we all know, these differences are maybe not always true, and or not true at all. So the truth about Eve, I very, very curious about our speaker tonight and his view on this issue on the gender, and looking at it as from his field of expertise. Professor Schaik is a biologist, primatologist, and evolutionary anthropologist who has had many positions in his field. He's nowadays, I have to take off my glasses, professor of biological anthropology and director of the Anthropological Institute, the University of Zurich. But he's been researcher for the Netherlands Foundation for the Advancement of Tropical Research, has had a position at Princeton University, was professor at the Department of Biological Anthropology, Anatomy at Duke University in Durham, and is, as I said before, professor and director of the Anthropological Institute and Museum at the University of Zurich, correspondent of the Royal National Netherlands Academy of Arts and Science, and he was Dubois the professor here in Maastricht in 2017, when he already visited us to talk about his book, The Good Book of Nature, a very interesting book that he wrote together with Kai Michel. He's also known for is actually best-selling author, known for his Sexual Selection in Primates, New and Comparative Perspectives, and A Good Book of Human Nature. Together with Kai Michel, he reflects in his most recent book, On the Truth About Eve, on 2 million years of human history. The lecture takes about an hour, after which there's time for a Q&A. I'll go around with the microphone. We finish around 9:30, 9:45. Please welcome Professor Carel van Schaik.
Thanks very much. It's always a pleasure to be back in Maastricht. Excuse me. And as you can tell from the title and the depictions on it, there will be something on the Bible, but it won't be too long, because I think most of you find scientific narratives more convincing at the moment, and that's exactly what we're trying to deliver here. The idea is that, as Rob already alluded to, that most of us believe that since men are stronger, and since that's what we've learned in school and that's what in the Bible, men are supposed to lead, they're supposed to be the more powerful members of society, etc., etc. And that's it. No discussion. Just swallow it. Take it. I'm here to tell you that that's not true. So I don't know whether I'm going to disappoint people, but maybe not. We'll find out. So let's start at the beginning, and that always used to be Adam and Eve. So let's go to Adam and Eve. And for those of you who may not read this literature as much as one should, perhaps, God created humans. Well, he once, and then he created man, and as an afterthought, woman as well. So he did it twice, just to make sure it all worked out. And then everything was really, really good. In fact, the Bible says that God was actually quite contented with what he had done. He was happy. And then, as you probably know, there was a snake, and a talking snake at that, who made Eve eat the fruit that allowed her to distinguish between good and evil. And by the way, Adam also ate, not to forget. And then when God found out, because they were suddenly ashamed of themselves, because now they knew the difference between good and evil, and they noticed they were naked, which comes back in the story. So, as you can see, they were expelled from paradise, and there were angels with sort of Star Wars kind of swords to make sure they couldn't come back. And the punishment was that they had to become farmers, which is quite interesting. That's what the previous book was all about. But, of course, the punishment was worse for the woman, because God said to Eve, and the Lord God said unto the woman, "What is it that thou hast done? Eaten the fruit." And so that was really the end of that part of the human career. So we had to become farmers. And just to make sure that the woman was punished in addition, on top of the expulsion, I will greatly multiply thy sorrow and thy conception. In sorrow thou shalt bring forth children, and thy desire shall be to thy husband, and he shall rule over thee. Interesting, isn't it? In fact, every sentence or part sentence here in this, what you might call this conviction, is actually correct historically. We now know from archaeology that all these things are correct. They get much more babies when they become farmers. They had much more trouble giving birth. There was a lot of disease. It was very unpleasant. And indeed, after that, the husband ruled over the wife. And so that runs way ahead of the story, of course, but you can sort of see when people started to write up Genesis, they realized that something had happened, and they needed a story because God was omnipotent. He knew everything, he did everything right, so how come they lived in such a mess when he was omnipotent? So there must have been a reason, and they were expelled from paradise because of some sin, the original sin, right? That was to make the story complete and to make sure that we can still understand why God is omnipotent. Now, that was, we don't know exactly when, but it was written up in the 6th century BC. And then, as you all know, there was a man named Jesus Christ, roughly around the year 0, no coincidence, by the way. And he had different ideas. He was extremely inclusive. There was no misogyny left in his group of followers. Women were an intrinsic part of the whole band. They were extremely egalitarian. They shared everything. They hated rich people. Remember, they couldn't get into heaven. That was very, very difficult for rich people. And so on and so forth. Basically, there were a bunch of egalitarians, a communist, you might even say, because again, they were sort of hunter-gatherers because they didn't farm, they didn't produce anything. And then, of course, that belief, it actually died out in Palestine, was exported into the Roman Empire. But the Roman Empire was pretty patriarchal already at that time. And the Apostle Paul wrote in his letter to the Corinthians something that is not so nice to women. Let your women keep silence in the churches, for it is not permitted unto them to speak, but they are commanded to be under obedience, as also saith the law. And if they will learn anything, let them ask their husbands at home, for it is a shame for women to speak in the church. So you see, the gains made by the Jesus movement were already lost, and basically sounds like we're straight back to the Old Testament. I could go on and speak about Luther and so on, which I won't do, because nothing changed, which is, again, quite interesting, because then we jump 1,500 years. But now you sort of know where Paul got it from, because Rome was, of course, under strong Hellenistic influence. And here's a couple of Aristotle quotes. A woman is a woman because she lacks particular properties. We must consider the essence of women as something that suffers from a natural incompleteness. The relation of male to females, or male to female probably, is by nature a relation of superior to inferior and ruler to ruled. And man is more able to lead than woman, unless he has an unnatural disposition, and we won't go into that, what he meant by that. So you see that the Greek philosophers, basically, my motto nowadays is they were all children of their time, right? So he didn't know any better, and he didn't know any better, even though he was one of the most famous philosophers ever, and also in his time very influential. And there is a reason for that, which I will address later on very briefly. But okay, then the Enlightenment comes. I'm jumping again. 2,000 years roughly. And you think, okay, now these Enlightenment people, basically they gave us science. They were extremely clever. And this is, to sum up a huge amount of literature, Sonja Maisek wrote a very nice paper in 1991. Needless to say, she was a feminist. In the biological respect, what these people did was what we now call reification, or in German Essentialisierung. You say that the sexes are different, but because they have two different essences. They're fundamentally different. There's a gasp between them. They're very different. So women are weak and subordinate to men. I mean, you can now fill in the blanks, right? Women are passive, irrational, particularistic, introspective. Women belong in the kitchen, men in the public sphere. So even the Enlightenment philosophers, no. Let's hope that scientists do better. Here's Charles Darwin, who was actually incredibly good at making the right predictions. We often read Darwin as biologists to see what he thinks about it, because, for instance, in the evolution of morality, he was about 100 years ahead of everybody else. But even here we see that it's different language, it's less value-laden, it's more descriptive, but we still see this difference, that man is more courageous, pugnacious, and energetic than woman, and has a more inventive genius, and blah, blah, blah. Whatever men do, they're better at it. He forgot to say they're also, on average, far worse at it. But that's not what's interesting here. And then, what do the engineers say, or the microbiologists? This is 1914, suffrage movement. The suffragettes were trying to get the women's vote. And this very famous man, he was the president of, I think it was called the American Association for Public Health, so he was not a sort of a nobody. Famous professor at MIT. Women shouldn't get the vote because mental exertion could jeopardize reproductive health. Women could become infertile if they did too much thinking, ladies. Be careful. Something has changed, I think, the last 100 years. And the problem is that women had inferior brains, which made them unsuited to the rigors of voting. Voting is extremely demanding, as you know. I know it's now easy to make fun of these people, of course, but there is sort of an unisono element here, right? So you go to the old Greek philosophers, you go to the theologians, and I didn't even talk about Augustine, or I didn't talk about Luther. We go to the Enlightenment philosophers, or we go to the scientists until almost the 20th century, or even in the 20th century, and they all said women are inferior to men. Now I assume that there's very few people in this room subscribing to that, and if they do, they don't dare anymore to say these things. So I'm not going to ask for a vote. But there are some very interesting questions. First, the question I won't address very much today is, how could all these people be so deluded? Well, how is that possible that now we know it can't be true? Look at this room, there's universities now have more women than men. So what is going on here? Now, there were always a few exceptions. And of course, women have throughout the ages thought that couldn't be quite right, but basically this is what we've learned. And it's extremely embarrassing, actually, if you think about it. I'm a scientist. What were all these people doing, and how come that happened? So we have a few options on the table. The first one is the one that I started out with, right? God has punished women more than men for the original sin, and they must accept their subordinate position. That worked for quite a long time, and as you know, what religion tends to do is you cannot question it, right? It's the word of God. So basically, again, you have to swallow that. That's all. At the moment, the power of conviction has faded, I suppose, and so God was replaced by biology. After Darwin, biology determines the power relations between the genders, and we must accept that men dominate women because they are superior in all respects. I mean, Darwin himself said so, right? So what you see is quite interesting, because as so often, you have an explanation that also doubles as a justification, right? So we explain why women are weaker than men, and therefore, and then we draw all kinds of interesting conclusions. That's the bad news. Here's the good news, and I will try to convince you that the second scenario is actually, the second narrative, you might say, is more convincing, and there's a lot of evidence for it, that some sex differences are indeed biologically anchored. We should not become biology deniers, because that is counterproductive. But the fact that men have great power in society is not directly due to biology, for reasons that I will explain, even though biology has something to do with it, but it's the product of a cultural development. And the very fact that it's cultural suggests we can change it if we want to. And in other words, it's not inevitable, and in fact, I mean, who am I preaching to here? In 21st century Netherlands, this is already well on its way. So, let's look at this second narrative in more detail. I have two exhibits, as they would say in a court of law. The first is I will show that there is a bunch of species in which males are larger, have more weapons, are meaner, can do all kinds of nasty things, but they don't to females, because the females somehow have what we call in English leverage over them. They can keep them in line. And the secret to that you will find out. But look at that swelling, it has something to do with it. And then the second thing is, and there's a neat, seamless transition between these things, is if you look at the ethnography of human societies, all these different kinds of societies that we've had, even if you don't buy, for worse reasons than I would agree with, that there has been a development in the kinds of societies from simple and small to very complex and hierarchical, etc. Even if you don't buy the sequence, you have to admit that there are societies in which men and women are equal. And that is enough to convince you, hopefully, to show that it's possible, can be done. There are people doing it, they're living it. And so if you add 1 and 2 together, that would say that that would be proof that the second scenario, the second narrative, is actually the empirically best supported one. So, here's a very simple graph where you look, every point here is a society where anthropologists went. Anthropologists were always describing customs and so on, but they're also measuring traditionally. They were measuring people and head circumference and all those things. We won't go into that, but here's the basic result of that. Wherever people go, with this one funny exception. Yeah. No, does it work? No. Oh, but that's not meant. Anyway, you see that there's one point close to the line, but basically there's a beautiful parallel line there, which means that wherever you go, men are about 10 centimeters taller on average than women, and that translates into like 25, 30, 35% greater body weight. And that is very similar to chimpanzees and bonobos, our closest living relatives. So in terms of dimorphism, not much has changed. And in particular, if you, sorry, I can't use a pointer, but if you look at that humans, that stuff in parentheses behind the 1.19, if you control for body fat, because we are a species in which women everywhere, no matter how, how the body build is, have more body fat. If you control for that, because it's hard to kill somebody with fat, but it's easier with muscle, you are actually smack within the range of chimps and bonobos. And so that's pretty dimorphic, as we would say in the business. And the question is therefore, okay, well, isn't the case closed? Doesn't that stop the whole discussion? Men are bigger, so what are we talking about? And indeed, if you think about it, chimpanzee males are incredibly nasty to females, especially when they're close to getting into estrus. Orangutan males are known to rape females between double, triple quotation marks, but I can tell you it's not pleasant to watch. Even gorilla males, gorillas are known to be so nice and friendly. They beat up females. Baboon males beat up females all the time until they get injured and all that. So, and then there's sexual coercion. In other words, that males force females into mating with them, even if it's only because they just won't give up, and at the expense of female fitness, either because they get injured, or because it's just costly because this male is on their case all the time, or because for infanticide avoidance, these females need to mate with multiple males. And so, yes, where males are a lot bigger among lots of primates, there are these kinds of behaviors that suggest that males dominate. But there are exceptions. And funny enough, these are exceptions, including the orangutans, which I won't talk about because they're a bit of a separate case. The bonobos on the top and the vervet monkeys on the bottom, where males are clearly bigger than females, and yet the females don't let themselves be dominated by them. And an interesting question is, okay, can we learn from these cases about what is it that makes bigger males refrain from beating up females, even if they could? They also have bigger canines, for instance. They could injure these females. They could force them by threatening to injure them, and yet doesn't seem to happen. So vervet monkeys we actually studied in South Africa, and we still study them. And the males are at least 30% bigger on average. Some of them are almost 50% bigger than females. And yet, if you watch them, these females, they can chase males away. And most importantly, if a male wants to mate, they say, no, don't try that in a chimp, because you get beaten up. And what we think is the reason is the females have so-called concealed ovulation, which means that their ovulation isn't advertised or visible or somehow signaled to males, and maybe also not to the females, although there's evidence that there's some weak evidence for the females, signal to the females themselves. And as a result, you can sort of imagine how that goes. If a male tries to force a female, she is not willing, he won't be invited next time, so to speak, right? So he's not invited back, and when it matters then, he's not going to be a preferred partner. Moreover, what was I going to say here? Yes, it'll come back in the bonobos, but also in the vervet monkeys, there's lots and lots of mating through each and every conception. If there's no signaling of ovulation, if you don't know when the moment suprême, so to speak, is there, at least approximately, then it hardly makes sense to fight with other males over a mating that has a probability of conception in the promille range rather than the 10%, 20% range, right? So, and the power that these females get from there is visible in the sense that they can force these males. So for instance, there's lots of between group encounters in these vervet monkeys, so the groups fight each other. But of course, when the males participate, that makes their group much stronger because these males are bigger and they can fight better. So what females do is they want to recruit these males to join them. But males are often a bit reluctant because they may have relatives in the other group and stuff like that, so they're not the most enthusiastic participants. So what females then do is they actually attack them. They say, come on, help us. And then he helps, and then it makes a big difference. And now the interesting part is, after that, the males that are nicely responding to these things, they actually get more matings than you would expect. In other words, it's not males forcing females, it's females rewarding males for being nice and being pleasant. Bonobos, the same story, big groups. Again, males are larger, but they don't usually attack females because especially if one female is attacked by a male, there's a coalition of females and he has to stop. And hey, females have concealed ovulation again. And here I can actually show you how this works, because here we have the same story as in the vervet monkeys, but here's how it's been very nicely documented they have concealed ovulation. In the vervets, it was 40 years ago, that was not as fancy as nowadays. So here you look at 0, that is where endocrinologically with pregnenolone rice, you know there's ovulation happening. And so fertile matings are in that little window before until that point. Then these horizontal lines are the female's sexual swelling. So when there's nothing, she's not swollen. When the line gets thick, she's at her maximum swelling. And now you see how wonderfully the swelling predicts ovulation. Not. Right? It doesn't, it's look at the lowest line. She was swollen, and then there's nothing. Or the top line, just as she stops being attractive, she ovulates, and then there's one in the middle, and so on. So basically, it's not predictable. Plus, these are just the ovulatory cycles. There's also a lot of cycles where she doesn't ovulate, but she has these swellings. Bonobos, females are almost always swollen. And you have to be extremely clever male to know when ovulation is likely, right? In other words, it's impossible. So you get the same story. It makes no sense for these males, because in bonobos, I think that's a statistic I should not withhold from you. There's a few thousand matings per conception. And that is, maybe you say, well, so what? But that's not very common in nature, put it this way. And so basically we have to figure out that dominance, in the sense that I'm stronger than you, I can beat you over the head, is not the same as power. I can influence your behavior. And that's what we're trying to show here. So power is a function of some balance between dominance, which is based on fighting ability, having allies, so having others helping you in conflict, and leverage. So who has the longer lever arm? If you have something that somebody else wants, but it's hard for them to take it by force, they better be nice to you, or else they won't get it. And if you see, that actually works beautifully. This math adds up, so to speak, for the vervet monkeys and the bonobos, because due to their coalitions and to the concealed ovulation, the combination thereof makes that these males, hold back and will not attack females, even though they could perfectly do so. Now let's add humans to the picture. What do we see in humans? Concealed ovulation. I'll show you a few slides. And in hunter-gatherers, which will be obviously the next topic in a few minutes, we have economic interdependence in that as hunters and gatherers, so males and females, men and women, have sort of complementary roles, and as a result, you can't say one is more important than the other, because if it's complementary, you need both. And so obviously this whole concealed ovulation is going to play a massive role in the argument, as you can tell also here from my equation. And so we need to find out how it works in humans. So here is a graph of the probability of conception when mating. And don't ask where the data come from, it's not very pleasant. But you see there's an interesting curve here. That looks like a regular curve, but it's actually quite unexpected. Because in most species, it should be 0 until ovulation, which is predictable at a particular time. So that curve should look like an iceberg, a very like the Matterhorn. But it doesn't. It's smeared out over a long period of time, already suggesting that ovulation is unpredictable. In fact, if you look at it, now we're calculating back from, there's that 0 again in the middle. We calculate back from the day of conception, of ovulation, sorry. The red line is progesterone, which does what it should do. After ovulation, you see a steep rise with a peak in the mid-luteal phase, and then it falls down again if there's no conception. But the blue line is what matters here. The blue line is female desire. And that doesn't follow the ovulation line, right? It doesn't peak around ovulation. It's flat and high all along until when it's obvious that the female isn't fertile, because progesterone smells clearly, even for humans, and there it comes down. And in case you still need to be convinced, this is a study that looked at, I think, a few 100,000 matings, self-reported by people all over the place, various countries and so on. And what you see is that it's pretty flat. So, and these are, by the way, these are estimated day of ovulation. So, but basically everybody mates all the time, except around menstruation, where in some cultures, quite a few actually, there are some taboos on mating. As you know, menstrual blood is evil. Don't ask me why. But so you see that this whole concealed ovulation thing is also quite prominently present in humans. So, to sum up this part, you can have a species that is clearly dimorphic in size and strength, where males are stronger than females, and still males don't dominate the females. They don't beat them up. They don't force them to do things. They don't constrain their behavior, because the females have concealed ovulation and they can form alliances. So, does that jibe with the ethnology and the ethnography? So for that I have to step back a little bit. Humans evolved, our ancestors became bipedal roughly 7 million years ago is the first good evidence. They started to look like us roughly 2.5 million years ago. And there's good archaeological evidence for stone tool use in hunting at about 2 million on the savannah. So that's all we know for sure. And then the rest we don't know exactly, but basically this hunting and gathering started then and became ever more sophisticated since then. And what I call human nature, or our first nature, uncontaminated by culture, so to speak, sort of the genetically anchored, like an anchor you can sort of wiggle, innate adaptations in our psychology, and that also means the kind of things we feel best when that is the case, we sort of are most comfortable with, reflect exactly this lifestyle that evolved. Even though, the anchor line can be long and we can end up quite far away from our preferences, and we still live and we still do okay, but that doesn't mean we thrive 100%. So if you then look at what these people do, like I said, starting at about 2 million, we developed this lifestyle until about 20,000 years ago, and a lot of people until a few hundred years ago, or maybe 50 years ago. What they do is they hunt and gather. Generally, men hunt, women gather, but as we'll see, all these things are not taken too solidly, not too monolithically. And as you can tell, it's in groups. They tend to go together, and in the old days it was even more, because there were still very, very dangerous animals out there. Then the food is shared. The gathered stuff mostly in the families, but the hunted stuff in the whole camp. They live in camps, on average around 30 people, but again, these are all averages. But there's a lot of sharing, and as you, for instance, see this guy there pointing, that's usually not the hunter. The hunter steps back and there's a whole ritual procedure as to how that should be done, but it's shared according to strict rules. And also our kids, that's one of the amazing things about humans. Our kids are allomothered. In other words, there's lots of people, it takes a village to raise a child. Lots of people involved in rearing kids, including older kids, but especially also grandmothers. And so the key word to remember about the hunter-gatherer lifestyle is interdependence. Everybody depends on other people, because you may be the best hunter, but you can get injured or you can get unlucky, and then you still need to eat. And you eat because you have the reputation of being a generous person who shares whenever he has it. Read the Bible. Share and you will receive. And that's exactly how it works in hunter-gatherers. It also means you can't be an unpleasant person, if you know what I mean, because then you don't get anything when you need it. And so you have to work on your reputation as a nice and generous person. And those things, of course, you already see in little children: reputation management, willingness to share, etc., etc. And that is what we call first nature. And you may have noticed that most of the people on the previous slide were darker skinned. It's simply because in some places where we still have hunter-gatherers, or had them until a few decades ago, agriculture hadn't come, but we have exactly the same situation about a few thousand years ago in, say, Europe, or here in Japan on the top, in northwest territories, or in eastern Siberia, the bottom, until relatively recently. So, these hunter-gatherers that are pretty egalitarian, what about power relations between men and women? And I'll just give you, instead of numbers, a few quotes. I know it's always, you can lie with quotes, but this literature is pretty straightforward because there's only one thing and they all say the same. Eleanor Leacock: with regard to the autonomy of women, nothing in the structure of egalitarian band societies, that's what hunter-gatherers of the nomadic version form, necessitated special deference to men. Okay? Kung society may be the least sexist of any we have experienced. Kung are the Kalahari people that have all kinds of movies and documentaries and so on. Phyllis Caberry from about Australia: if husband and wife quarrel, the wife will pack up her goods and chattels and move to the camp of a relative till the loss of an economic partner, interdependence, brings the man to his senses and he attempts a reconciliation. Okay? Probably sounds familiar. The key to success in foraging is teamwork. They have complementary roles, they need each other, and therefore you have a balanced power relation. And in case you're not convinced, by the way, these are all feminist anthropologists, really. Here's another one who they were all fighting with their male colleagues who didn't want to believe them, and say it appears that people who have actually lived with hunter-gatherers and have actively looked for male bias within the society find it far easier to accept that there can be societies where sexual egalitarianism can exist than those students of societies where men are clearly dominant. As you can imagine, we have the same things in primatology. My species does this. Your species doesn't, must be wrong. Right? That's an example of what we see here. It's very hard to accept for a lot of people in those days that there were societies where men didn't dominate, didn't have the full power, were not in charge of everything. Okay. But what's the conclusion? If you add 1 and 2 together now, back to my concealed ovulation and these monkeys and apes, and now the hunter-gatherers, biology plays a role in gender differences, but it's not biologically determined. And I will skip this just to be quick because I'm, as usual, running out of time. So, what happened? Why did it go wrong? What happened there? Well, as most of you know, around 12,000 years ago, the last ice age sort of ended and the climate suddenly became pretty nice and equitable, much less variable, and people started for the first time to produce their food and to domesticate animals and plants and so on, rather than gather and hunt. And very quickly, this led to all kinds of ever more advanced forms of agriculture. The earliest stages we call horticulture. They were extremely extensive. They were often so-called swidden, so they moved from place to place. They had trees that they visited. They were also still doing a lot of gathering and hunting when possible, until you get to horticulture with metal tools, that is already much better, and to intensive agriculture with iron plows and draft animals and etc. And fixed areas where often inundated with water to make sure the crops grow better, etc., etc. And so you see that takes about 5,000 to 7,000 years before you're there, and only in particular places. So you still have the full spectrum until about 200 years ago. You still had the full spectrum somewhere represented. But of course, as a result, because this intensive agriculture produces a lot more food than horticulture, you get populations that grow, societies that grow, societies that become ever more unequal, and end up, the early states were basically kleptocracies, dictatorships, whatever you call them, that were extremely uneven and had lots and lots of enslaved people in them. So basically you see in about 10,000 years, roughly speaking, a completely unprecedented and totally dramatic change in how people lived, in terms of how they made their living, and in how they lived in terms of what their societies looked like, in the places that went through these developments. Not everywhere, of course. So we had higher densities, we got a lot of new diseases, wars became much, much more prominent, and the inequality within societies exploded. So, what happened? Why did it become unequal, not just among men, but also between men and women? The first one was in places with horticulture, where yields are pretty low. You get villages that are small and scattered, and nothing above it. No social organization that's higher than that. And you can still get that they run out of land, and they get competition with neighbors. And you can form alliances with some neighbors, but not with others, or the neighbors beyond the neighbors you can attack, and so on and so forth. And so you see a lot of raiding in those societies. For those of you, basically the Greek polises were a bit like that, but the Yanomami in the well described and also many people in Borneo where I worked were like this. So what you get is sort of a vicious cycle. The density is a bit high, there's not enough place to go, so there's a risk of being raided. When we're being raided, we need all the men, related men, because related men fight better than unrelated men. But because we have only so few people, we prefer sons, because we need sons for the defense. And we always got our women from other villages anyway, because we have to avoid inbreeding like everybody else. But how do we get our girls then? Well, we just raid them. We just capture them somewhere else. And if this sounds like a strange story, I didn't make it up. This is what anthropologists deduced from both the ethnography that they had, plus from interesting patterns in what you might call sex ratios. So the proportion of men in groups. And this is looking at children in the original situation when these guys came, and in the situation after, because usually it coincides with states telling people to stop killing each other. You know, head hunting is not something states like, and they forbid it. And what you see is that the sex ratio during these war times was around 56% males, whereas normally it's around 51.5% among children. And indeed, that's where you end up in the blue, right, later. So that difference was due to female infanticide and female neglect. So there's a systematic neglect of women in these kinds of societies. Well, it turns out that these kinds of societies were not the ones that became the big empires, of course, because they had a very low resource base. But it's striking that in a lot of these places, people still have a preference for sons. And I suspect that's because of this. More important was the second pathway, in the high-intensity agriculture place, where after a while, people figured out that instead of communal ownership, you could have private ownership. And of course, they also had to do the defense, so you got male alliances that were patrilocal, so they stayed at the place where they were born, and as soon as inequality arises, you become patrilineal, so titles and ownership goes in the paternal line. Women have to be switched between these clans, traded like chattel, and they become the property of the clan or the husband they marry into. And so once you have private property, you get a very interesting phenomenon. Namely, you can, if you're a man, let your son inherit your wealth. And if you're a rich man, you can take many wives. And you can have multiple sons inherit some of your wealth. But of course, you can't have everybody get an equal share, because this is how it works. This is where states arose in these areas. If you look at this graph, it's a very basic mammalian thing. Females get pregnant. That's the red line. And if they mate with 3 men or 75 men, it doesn't really make a lot of difference in their reproductive success. A little bit maybe because of infanticide avoidance, for instance, but it's not very much. But now you look at a man taking extra wives can have more and more and more offspring. You have heard of harems, but you haven't heard of whatever, hisms or whatever they are, right? You can be the most powerful queen or empress, and you don't have a whole collection of men as studs. We just don't do these things. That creates an asymmetry in opportunities for wealth accumulation. Because now, in the hunter-gatherers, we don't see this stuff because dads are needed to look after the children. And so you can have occasional polygyny, but that's free choice by the woman, because there's discrepancies in how many people there are, and they have to make do. But here we can say, okay, I'm rich, I have land, I have stores, I have real estate, later I have money, I can just buy somebody to look after my children. So that is out of the equation. And the other thing is, a lot of societies, in these kinds of situations, the men make the rules. So they say polygyny, fine. Serial monogamy, no problem. And so rich men can now accumulate wives. And as a result, the variance in male and female reproductive success goes from around 1 in under monogamy to 2 and 3 in full polygyny. And as a result, of course, women are being traded, they're worse off. We all know that there's a lot of research that shows that women that are married polygynously do less well than women that are married monogamously. Plus, there's also a lot of men who don't get to play now, because obviously, if one man, like a king, has 300 wives, there's 299 men that have no wives, obviously. These things didn't happen before. This is all new, right? And obviously, these guys made the rules. And they made the rules. Powerful people make rules that everybody has to abide by. In case you think I'm making this stuff up, there is nowadays very good genetics, large amounts of data, where people can estimate backwards how genetically diverse genomes are, and there you can turn into so-called effective population size estimates. And if you look on the left-hand side, it's the Y chromosome genes that are only inherited in the paternal line, obviously. And what you see is the first dotted line, sorry, I don't have a pointer. The first dotted line, vertical around 50, is sort of corresponding to the out of Africa. Of course, there was a lot more land, a lot more people all over the place, so it goes up, and it keeps on rising. The next dotted line is roughly when we started to settle down and start agriculture. And it always, there's a bit of a discrepancy in these estimates because of technicalities. But you see, it crashes. even though populations exploded. And now the last few thousand, you see it bounces up. After all, we have 8 billion now. Now look at the females. Mitochondrial DNA, only in the maternal line. 50,000 out of Africa, everybody goes up. Agriculture, oh, everybody keeps going up. And now we're still up. What explains that discrepancy? I used to think it was just polygyny, but it was rather, it plays a role, but it can't be the full story. Now, the last few years, Svante Pääbo got the Nobel Prize today. He's a geneticist who did a lot of this kind of work as well. A lot of people are using the techniques he developed. It's hostile takeovers. So it is areas where there's a lot of production, a lot of people being produced, and they have superior technology, and they swarm out all over the place. And guess what? The women are not killed, but the men are killed. In case you were wondering why that was, remember the previous slide. So, this is, for those of you who are interested in the Bible, there will be PDF later, but I'm looking at the clock, so I'll skip this one. If you want to understand Genesis, this slide explains it all. Okay, so, what happened to these women, in other words? What is their problem now? First of all, they were taken out of their families, right? So they were isolated. They were the property of a clan, along with other women who were not their relatives, mostly. And so they were in this family trying to make do. And oh boy, if they would not produce male heirs, they were in trouble. Because that's their function in life. Remember, that's what a lot of philosophers also say. The role of woman is to reproduce. And so, and that was a risky business, because if you do not produce male heirs, I'm just telling you about Henry VIII in case you're wondering. That is not necessarily good for you. And also, if your husband tends to die, which they do sometimes, because they were warriors also, you have to marry his brother. Because the money has to stay in the patriline. It cannot go somewhere else, right? Perhaps more interestingly, but less debated and less obvious, they lost their sexual autonomy. In hunter-gatherers, women go topless. Young people have sex all they want. Nobody tells them not to do these things. But once you're in this kind of situation, remember, the powerful men want heirs. They don't want cuckold kids. Their kids have to be theirs for it to work. So they're going to be now very strictly monitoring and guarding and locking up and whatever else is necessary their women, to make sure that, first of all, you marry them as a virgin, so that, you never know. Plus, usually the virgins don't have sexually transmitted diseases, which came along as well, etc., etc. But you see, in other words, the women totally lost all their autonomy, and they could not. Remember the concealed ovulation and the multiple mating and so on. They could not use their weapon of yore as a way of getting power equality with the men. So it was all gone. And just to hammer one more thing home, raiding and rape are much more common in societies where the sexes are you have to read this the other way around, right? It's absent. So this is Peggy Sanday Reeves did a great survey, again, 40 years ago, rather ignored work, that where the sexes are equal, you don't find that, and where the sexes are unequal, you find much more commonly raiding and rape. So basically, this is how patriarchy came around, or came to be. And why do we need this lecture? Why do we do this? This is old literature. How come we didn't know this? Well, a lot of it was because if you only read the old sources and not the sort of the late 20th century anthropology by feminists at that, who weren't men, writing came much later than these kinds of developments. So for instance, one thing that people said to us, well, you think that Genesis reflects things that happened thousands of years before. How could this be? Yeah, that was a good question, actually. But it turns out it does, but that's the miracle. But if you read written sources, and as a historian, that's all you have, right? If you read and read and read, you don't see these things. First of all, there were no women to write anything. And second, it was all full patriarchy everywhere, because horticulturalists, some of whom are matrilineal, they didn't write. They have no history, nobody noticed. Where we have the written sources are the empires, are the places where patriarchy was fully established. So that explains that. And now, if I may have a few more minutes, a couple of thoughts on gender differences, because of course they won't go away. It's a big, big issue. So basically, whatever you measure in a group of people, and you, for ease of reference, we just take male and females, and could take all kinds of other things, but let's take male and females. You get a distribution, right? With usually a difference in the mean. In this case, the pinkers do better than the bluers on that particular measure. But pretty much any measure you can take, you get something like this. But it turns out, and I could give you a whole lecture on that, that if you make these people grow up in different conditions, or you socialize them different, you give them different influences, you can manipulate the size of that difference between the distributions. In other words, what we call plasticity, or you could call it a biology-culture interaction, is alive and well, is happening very commonly in humans. So that's number one. In other words, issues about differences and whether they're wide apart or close together, when they're wide apart, you can often make them much smaller. One example recently is that, for instance, spatial orientation in women used to be much worse than in men. And people had beautiful interpretations. It's hunter-gatherers, men go farther away. And now that men and women can both go out of the house just as much, this difference is getting much, much smaller, and probably it'll soon be gone. The other thing is, yes, so as a group, we are different. Groups show a mean difference, right? But the closer you are, like in this particular case there, the more you have bluers that may be larger than the pinkers in that particular trait, right? And of course, once the thing is gone, it's 50-50. And of course, once they're completely separated, it's 0. But because you can play around with that, in most traits that we're interested in, you get a lot of overlap. And you cannot say, men are on average than women, and therefore every man. No, of course not. I mean, this is a very trivial point in terms of statistics, but it's very meaningful when you think in terms of societies. And the third point is that instead of trying to make all these deltas 0, we should worry more about the normative interpretation by the most powerful gender. So in this case, these pinkers, if they're higher scoring on that particular measure, they say, we're better than the bluers, right? It's not just different, it's better. And this, you think, is something that wouldn't happen. It is virtually universal. So it's known as reification, first of all. So if differences between two distributions exist, they are solid, they're monolithic, and they're prescriptive. It's the naturalistic fallacy. So this is the way it is, and therefore it's the way it should be. So you make two mistakes at a time. First of all, you pull them apart, and second, you say this is how it should be, not just how it is. It's been done all the time. And then there's the historical fallacy. Remember, it has always been like this, is what you often hear when you travel somewhere and you ask people why they do things. And you always get this answer, which again is both an explanation and a justification at the same time. And interestingly, think of this male production of heirs. I didn't even talk about primogeniture because I jumped over that, so that the oldest son gets everything. And if you ask people, why does the oldest son get everything? They say, it's what we've always done. No, we now know that is something that came with private property and etc. And patriarchy. It wasn't happening before. So this is often not right. But then there is a problem in the sense that this is a very tricky situation. Think about power differences between the genders. You know, we have heard for 2,500 years, it's normal, it's either God-willed or it's natural, even though a lot of people didn't want that to be true. So they never believed it. But if we never believe anything, then we're in trouble because we're also scientists and we want to believe in the facts that we produce. So maybe, again, there, we should be careful in saying it cannot be true, even though in many cases, like in this particular case, we can show, takes a bit of time, but we can show that it's actually the way we thought it would be, we intuited it to be, even though a lot of very powerful people told us that it wasn't true. But what if it is true? So then we have to look at a few cases. So for instance, only women get pregnant, correct? I mean, again, nowadays you can do all kinds of stuff, but historically that was correct. And the second is, almost everywhere, and probably pretty much everywhere, you see that men are more willing to escalate, to take risks, to use violence to get where they want to go. And so you can look at early development, and you can look at ethnographically. That seems to be true almost everywhere, if not everywhere. And so what do we do about those cases? We can either say, I don't want this to be true, therefore it can't be true, in which case society will not take you too seriously. Or you can say, well, let's figure out what to do about this. So for instance, okay, reproduction. Well, we already know it makes no difference for lots of other traits that we really think are much more important. No, let's say reproduction is not important, sorry. But if we feel that men and women should have equal opportunities, we have to just create the conditions where the playing field is level. And we're getting there now. We have parental leave and so on, these things. We're not there yet, but we're on our way. So this is something where we know there is a natural handicap or a natural disadvantage to one gender versus the other. We can do something about it. And the escalation thing, yes, there are conditions, think of that private property, where that really is an issue, right? And when you have a society without a state that has the monopoly on violence and on punishment, you get these fraternities, these male clans that have to basically take the, do all these things themselves, and then you get these things. But we don't have to. We, in a society today, we don't need that anymore. So we can just say, well, get rid of it. We can just get rid of it. There's no reason why we should accept these things. And then this whole differential tendency to escalate and use violence and so on, it just doesn't happen because the situations don't arise in which that is necessary. Okay, and I'll skip these next ones because time is up. So I'm going to summarize. Before the Neolithic came around, and people were nomadic hunter-gatherers, there were pretty much a balance of power between the genders, with the magic word interdependence. Then the Neolithic Revolution, so not so long ago, less than 10,000 years in most places, a few hundred in some other places, it wasn't a conspiracy, right? It was things that happened. It led to particular constellations where men needed to work together to defend. They stayed together in clans, and they figured out private property at one stage, etc. But all these things, the biology didn't change. The culture changed. And if you, or the majority of people say we don't like this, you can change it because there's nothing in biology that forces you to do this. And it's remarkable, actually, that the return to the original sort of first nature kind of situation where we believe that gender equality was the fact took so long the first case was religion. Religion had a strong hold on people. And the second one was, which is something I talked about to some of you earlier, that people cannot imagine that other groups are different because they encounter different situations, they had different upbringings, but we're always thinking they are different for fundamental reasons. They are really different. And of course, if you believe that, then of course you can always justify that our system is better and other people do things wrong. And so with that, sorry about rushing the last little bit, but I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you for this, Professor van Schaik. Any questions? Let's start quickly. We have about 20, 25 minutes. We'll end back.
How can you explain that private ownership actually went to men and to women? Because if men were dying because of wars, it makes more sense that women get the ownership and not men.
Yes, that's a technocrat solution that seems fair and honorable and all that. But remember, we're talking about successful men, because all the other men, they had nothing. So the minute you get, this is a development that happened on all continents except Australia, independently. So the minute you get big surpluses that need to be defended, men stick around with their families. Interestingly, the horticulturalists have the highest tendency to be matrilineal, but once you get to these high surplus situations, the men have to stick together, and if one dies, then the next one becomes the leader, and they have the same interest. So it is the men's collective interest, as it were, that started to prevail. And here's the funny part. Once you're in the system and you can't change it, a woman has exactly the same interest because it's their sons that will then become successful. So these are, in biology we call evolutionarily stable strategies. These are things that just happen because it's sort of like everybody comes up with their best strategy, and then the equilibrium that arises is this way, and it's extremely hard to get out of it again.
That sounds very positive, stable. Evolutionary stable.
Well, yeah, but
nothing wrong with stable, right?
But if you're on the losing side in that equilibrium, you're not necessarily happy with it.
No, of course not.
Yeah.
No. Yeah.
Thank you for the really interesting lecture. You quoted a lot of feminist anthropologists, and also I guess your research and conclusions definitely contribute to the feminist agenda. So my question is, do you consider yourself a feminist, and if yes or no, why?
I've never had this question before. No. The standard answer I have to is a counter question. Can you define what a feminist is? Because there's so many different kinds of feminism. I am the kind of, I think you would call it liberal feminist, that says, okay, I firmly believe, probably because of my genes, that men and women should have equal opportunities, and there's no reason, did I say something wrong? I mean, but, sorry, I have a mathematician friend who always, when I propose, but isn't it obvious, right? It's in the constitutions. So what are we discussing? I don't get it. So in that respect, everybody should be a feminist, right?
Any others? No hands? Maybe someone on the balcony? You have to shout out, though. Don't get to the balcony with the microphone. Oh, here, yes.
One over there. Oh.
Thank you so much. It was a very interesting lecture. I was thinking while listening to you to a book I only actually skimmed, but it's by a couple of colleagues of yours, in a sense, David Graeber and David Wengrow, on The Dawn of Everything. Sorry. It's become a bit of a bestseller, and unfortunately I couldn't really read it, but there is I got some of the points they say, and if I get them right, they are trying to depotentiate a bit this idea that there is such a huge divide between hunter-gatherers, egalitarianism, and the rise of inequality or patriarchy in bigger societies. So what's your take on this? Do you think that this is in a way compatible with your argument, or do you think that they are really going in a different direction?
It's pretty incompatible, and you should read some of the reviews. But and I think the reason is, unlike me, they have a political agenda. Now, I know. See, this is the whole debate we always have as soon as you start to talk about people. And it's very hard to get the facts. I spent 2 weeks this summer torturing myself through this book. And so I know what I'm talking about. and really, you should read some of the reviews from anthropologists who know what they're talking about, because they take a lot of liberties with the truth, I have to say. One of this is this. They say, look, there's hunter-gatherers like that, there's inequality, and that's true. These are so-called sedentary foragers, or complex foragers, they talk about them some, and look at how much wealth they have and so on. Because as soon as you know it from yourself, right? As soon as you become sedentary, you can produce clutter. You don't have to carry it around anymore, and so you can make interesting traps that are big and difficult, and so on and so forth. And you can make luxury goods to trade. But there's 2 points to make. So one, yes, they become unequal, and there's good old anthropological literature that shows the more you depend on storage and the more you're sedentary, in other words, the more you deviate from this nomadic hunting and gathering that I've always been talking about. And this didn't start until 20,000 years ago. So in terms of our psychology, this is probably too recent to make a big impact. Then you get social stratification. So that's point one. So yes, there are socially stratified foragers, but they're always of the sedentary food-storing variety. Second, if you now look at what we mean by social stratification there, it is these men compete. In the old days, they competed about who was the best hunter or who was the best shaman or whatever. Now they compete in who can give away the most goodies. You may have heard of the potlatch, right? I think they mention it too somewhere. In other words, before we started to compete, private property, by excluding others and accumulating things, you got competition through generosity. The most generous guy wins. That was the idea. And that's the potlatch idea, right? And you give these people, you give away your wealth, and that's how you show how great you are. So that whole thing started to change with private property. Here we still have communal land, the clan owns everything, but the clan is now in charge of things because there's a piece of land that they can now claim, and etc., etc. So this is sort of the nice, very nice study where they looked at all the ethnography, and as I said, you know, sharing is the highest law of the nomadic hunter-gatherers. Once you have food storage, that sharing goes down. And these guys were storing food. So basically it's human nature. If I don't have to share anymore, if I become less interdependent, I can be more selfish. And still, funny enough, this selfishness, because of the whole tradition, was still expressed mainly in out-generositizing the next guy. It was quite interesting. So that is my main problem with Graeber and Wengrow, and as a lot of other colleagues have also pointed out.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed your talk so much. So I would like to know if I got a correct take-home message. even though we are living in Netherlands and there are a lot of attempts to make equality between men and women, but it's still the truth is in reality in daily life even, or as a person who works in academia, under the layers we still have this inequality. So to overcome this, do I hear correctly that I need to make alliance, and also I need to somehow ask my male community that if you be nice to me, I will reward you somehow in different ways, not in that way that you audience think, but similarly, like, you know, if you be nice to me, somehow I will reward you. So to be able to remove them from the position of power, does it mean that I'm still in this position of putting more attempt to, like, you know, I have to put more attempt, I have to try more to make alliance and tell them be nice to me and somehow reward them afterwards in order to be equal? So do I still have to do that?
Life is a struggle, right? But look, I mean, be patient. Your generation will be the ones who are sitting here in 20 years, and you are ticking very differently from the generation of my parents. And so it'll happen. It just, well, you don't need to be patient. You just need to build alliances, regain your sexual autonomy, regain your economic autonomy, and everything will be fine. So basically, this is the recipe. This is the recipe for women's liberation, you could say. And it's also the recipe for a lot of other people, probably, to liberate themselves. But
the fact that I have to continue the fight is a little bit painful, but the fact that we are gonna reach there, it's hopeful, actually.
Well, what's the alternative? You know, in the old days, you could say this is God's will, and therefore it will all be done. But now it's a political debate where my role is to make sure the arguments are clean. Right? That people use the correct arguments. You can still believe that women should be discriminated against. Fine, maybe not, but you cannot use the fact that men are bigger to say, well, this is how it should be. And you have to also be careful when people make these arguments that they're always mixing up descriptive and normative. And that if you become more aware of those things, you can keep the debate clean. And then in the end, our arguments will probably convince most rational people. Hopefully.
And that is actually a nice ending, that we should listen to arguments that you've been giving us to get further in this development, because of course I do understand this idea that we've been, if you're battered or you've been mistreated by men for maybe generations, then should you indeed say, okay, I have to be nice to them to get what I want from them, or should I just hit back, right? But I think arguing is very important, and you've given us a lot of them to have this conversation amongst each other. Then final question.
Thank you for your very interesting lecture. I missed two things in becoming equal, men and women. First is birth control.
Say that again?
Birth control.
Yeah. It's in there.
Yeah, it's in there.
Sexual autonomy.
But you see that now men and women here in Western Europe are more equal than we were in the time that you and me were grow up.
Right.
One thing is birth control. The other thing is technical. We are better and better.
Technical progress.
Strong. No. What I mean, what I want to say is, if we are in a fist fight, you probably win.
Ah, sure.
But if I pull the trigger,
yes,
you won't be so sure.
Totally. Yes. Well, exactly. And this is such an interesting point, right? But remember, all these examples I gave, as soon as war comes along, it's the men who form these alliances and do the fighting. That's throughout history. Yes, there were these Amazons, but it's probably, as Graven Wengro again, it's probably mainly fantasy, and even they admit that. So, but that doesn't have to be true anymore. By the way, one of the most persistent sex differences is in throwing. Apparently men are always better. Remember my little delta? It's hard to get those distributions to overlap a lot. That seems to be linked to a genetic difference in shoulder morphology and so on. And so you can sort of imagine when you have to throw spears at mammoths that matters. And also when you throw spears at enemies, it matters. But once you get bows and arrows, it already doesn't matter. And this is probably where the Amazon fantasy comes from, because if you're on a horse and you can ride a horse and you can shoot bows and arrows, if you're a woman or a man, doesn't make much difference, except when tradition tells you you're not allowed to do these things, which is happening in a lot of societies. But so now we can have an honest debate about whether women should also be drafted into armies, because most fighting now is pushing buttons, right? It's like you used to play video games and now you play them in real time and with real consequences. Totally fair. I encourage a debate. I mean, ideally we don't get war, right? But we've just woken up about a few months ago that maybe was a bit too optimistic. Yeah, and then we can have that debate. I know there's probably a lot more questions you want to end. I'm still around for answering further questions or actually having more discussions.
Okay, I do want to thank you. I actually also, when I said, what do you say? The balance, if that's okay, then it's fine. Or that sounds so positive, but of course, when there's a balance settled in a society that you sketched, but there's power differences, then that's a high toll to pay. And I think again we learned a lot about arguments against this. Coming Friday, we have a program coming up in the Bonafante Museum. You can enter in the evening. It's very nice because you can go around all the rooms. It's for free, so you can see the museum and the art. But we're also shaking patriarchy. So it's all about the topic of tonight. Maybe a bit more active. So maybe a bit more the fight instead of turning the cheek and being nice. But hope to see you maybe there on Friday, and otherwise at one of the other lectures. Coming up also of a primatologist, which is almost online. It will be online this week, is Frans de Waal, world famous primatologist. He's coming, and he's also talking about the gender topic. He's coming the 14th of November, so keep an eye on our website. Thank you very much. Thank you, Carel van Schaik.